Join us on Bookmark this month as we bring you some of our favorite early episodes from past seasons, highlighting distinguished Catholic authors. This week, we're featuring my interview with Dr. Peter Kreeft, in which he talked about two of his books, Three Approaches to Abortion and Winning the Culture War. This episode originally aired in November of 2004. And thank you for joining us right here on the campus of Boston College at Burns Library to visit with Dr. Peter Kreeft. We're going to talk to Dr. Kreeft about a couple of his books entitled Three Approaches to Abortion and also How to Win the Culture War. Once more, thank you so much, Dr. Kreeft, for taking the time to talk to us. We've had a couple of interviews on specific books, and this one we're going to talk about two different books. The first half, I wanted to talk about Three Approaches to Abortion, and as we talked before the show, these kind of both go together to some degree overall into the culture war we're fighting right now, right?
Sure, because abortion is the main battlefield.
Okay. You say there's three approaches to abortion. How'd you come up with three?
Well, I just wrote these three essays, and they turned out to be the three approaches, so it was a title that covered the whole waterfront.
What did you write the essays for?
For myself, basically, and for talks that I gave around the country. One of them is quite rational, one of them is psychological, and one is the interplay between sort of a rationalist and a psychologist.
Now, on the cover it says, a thoughtful and compassionate guide to today's most controversial issue. Thoughtful and why did you want to make sure you portrayed thoughtful and compassionate?
We're supposed to speak the truth in love. So unless you speak the truth, you can't be thoughtful. Unless you're thoughtful, you can't speak the truth. So that's the rational aspect. Compassion is an essential ingredient in love, so that's the personal aspect, so you have to do them both together. So it just so happened that I had these three articles on abortion. One was a rational argument, one was a psychological exploration of our motives, and the third was a dialogue in which a psychologist and a rationalist were interacting.
So that's where you talk about the three angles being the impersonal, the personal, and the dialogue. Right. Okay. One thing that struck me, and I didn't want to jump ahead because you brought up the dialogue, the thing that struck me wasn't that you did this very interesting dialogue, but that the people involved in them, Libby, the pro-choicer, is a sassy, classy black feminist, and Isa is the pro-lifer, is a Muslim fundamentalist philosopher. Those wouldn't be the typical people would tend to find arguing about abortion, would it be?
No, they don't usually talk to each other, but they're two characters from a novel that I'm writing. And they emerged from the writing process. It's amazing how writing fiction is so different than writing philosophy. You can't, if you're a good writer, push them. You can't fabricate them. They tell you who they are. So these are two extreme characters, but viable and believable characters.
Okay. And you say this book is designed for obviously two groups of people, for the pro-lifers and the pro-choice. How do you reach both of them simultaneously without seeming to take too much of a position?
You just write an honest book and hope that they read it. I've had some pro-choice reaction to a previous book on abortion, which was a Socratic dialogue called The Unaborted Socrates, in which Socrates wakes up in the 20th century in an abortion clinic and has some dialogues with the author, with the doctor, and also with a legal scholar and with a psychologist. And a number of pro-choicers have said, you know, that's a more interesting book than I thought pro-lifers could write, or a more convincing book than I thought pro-lifers could write, or you make at least an honest case for it. So I think we're reaching a little bit to the other side.
And even that attitude is something you kind of deal with in here, is the idea of what pro-choicers think of pro-lifers, right, and how they categorize them.
Yeah. They wonder where we're coming from. I think they don't really understand most of the time. Now,
the book has three parts, as you mentioned before, and you alluded to it, but it's the Apple argument against abortion. That has nothing to do with the computer. So
no.
What is an Apple argument?
I start with the premise that we know what an apple is. Until you start arguing philosophy, you know what an apple is. Everyone will admit we know what an apple is. In 15 steps, I take you from the proposition that we know what an apple is to the conclusion that abortion is so wrong that it must be outlawed. And I think most people who disagree with that conclusion can be forced back up against the premise. Most pro-choicers do not believe in objective truth or our ability to know it, because if they did and they were honest, they would see very clearly that if abortion isn't wrong, nothing's wrong.
Now, in one part towards the end of this, in the section that talks about the argument from skepticism, I think that most likely response to my argument will be the charge of dogmatism. You talk about these 4 different ways of thinking about the fetus, and then you go to relate to how, depending on how you would think of it, what kind of a crime it would be.
I think this is a more effective argument than most for pro-choicers, because most positive arguments that we offer will be met by skepticism. Well, you claim to know, but we don't claim to know. So I say in this argument, well, suppose we don't know. Either we know or we don't know what a fetus is. And either it is a human being or it isn't. So there's 4 possibilities, not just 2.
Okay.
So let's examine what abortion is in each of these 4 possibilities. Number 1, we know what a fetus is, and we know that it's a human being. And we kill it anyway. That's murder. That's deliberate murder.
Okay.
Second, we know what a fetus is, and it's not a human being. In that case, abortion is perfectly innocent. But I challenge anyone to prove to me that a fetus is not a human being. Now, suppose we don't know. Those are the other 2 possibilities. You don't know whether a fetus is human or not, and you kill it, and it turns out that it is a human being. Well, that's maybe not deliberate murder, but it's certainly homicide. That's like running over a man-shaped overcoat in the road. You don't know whether there's a man in it or whether it's just an overcoat. That's like shooting at a bush that's moving. Maybe it's a hunter, maybe it's a deer. Final possibility, we don't know what a fetus is, and we kill it, and it turns out not to be a human being after all. But we didn't know that it wasn't a human being. So that's at least criminal negligence. That's like shooting when you're not sure there's not a person there. So in 3 out of the 4 cases, abortion is criminal.
Right. And so you're saying, so skepticism cannot count for abortion, but only against it.
Yeah,
only if you were not a skeptic can abortion be moral.
Yeah, the Supreme Court, amazingly, in the Roe v. Wade decision, based its conclusion that abortion should be legal in some cases on the premise that we don't know when human life begins. Well, if you don't know when human life begins, don't shoot, for goodness sakes.
When in doubt.
Yeah. That's a fundamental moral principle. Take the morally safer course.
In this section, a concluding plea, you say, I hope someone can show me where I have gone wrong in this argument. Has anybody challenged you on this argument?
No, and I'm honest there. We pro-lifers, we expend a lot of our time and life and effort and money on this cause. And if we could be convinced that it was worthless, that abortion is perfectly all right, we could save a lot of psychic energy and a lot of time and a lot of money. But nobody's been able to do that.
Earlier in that chapter, you say most pro-choice arguments during the first 2 decades after Roe v. Wade was passed disputed the scientific premise of the pro-life argument. Perhaps this was usually dishonest rather than honest ignorance, but perhaps not, and at least it did not directly deny the essential moral principle in premise 2. But pro-choice arguments today increasingly do just that. Perhaps pro-choicers perceive that they have no choice here, for scientific facts are not deniable and moral principles are. Whatever the reason, it is a vast sea change, for the camel of moral relativism has gotten not just his nose under the tent, but his torso.
The fundamental pro-life argument has 2 premises. 1, it's always morally wrong to deliberately kill an innocent human being. Second premise, an unborn human baby, a fetus, a human being in its fetal stage, is a human being and is innocent. Conclusion, it's always morally wrong to abort a human being. To get out of that argument, you have to deny one of the 2 premises. If you deny the second premise, that's just scientific ignorance. You can still believe that murder is wrong, but not believe that abortion is murder. If you deny the first premise, then you have to compromise a very fundamental moral principle. If murder isn't wrong, what is wrong? So to deny the first premise, you've got to be a moral relativist and a subjectivist. And that's where the pro-choice movement has gone. It used to argue scientifically that we're not sure that a fetus is a human being, maybe it's just a blob of tissue. That was such a weak argument that they couldn't maintain it. So they have to take refuge in moral
technology
relativism.
kind of eliminated that defense, that hiding place.
Yeah, the more science you know, the more you know that that's impossible. In fact, before Roe v. Wade, all the science textbooks in the world said that the beginning of a new individual life happens at conception because the genetic code is complete only then. That's true of every mammal, and it's true of human beings too. They don't say that anymore. It's politically incorrect. They leave that question open. So science itself is skewered.
Now, in between Section 1 and Section 2, you have a historical postscript. Why did you decide to add that in?
I don't remember what that is. Let me see.
It's a little part where you talk about that RU-486
oh, yes.
pill is being made by the same people or connected to Zyklon B?
Well, when Nazi Germany was dismantled after the war, the IG Farben people who made the gas that gassed the Jews in the Holocaust, Zyklon B, went to France, I believe, and their personnel formed a new chemical company, and it still exists. A branch of it, I think it's called a Höchst company, right. Produces now this abortion drug from China. It's illegal in America, but it's a kind of eerie connection that the people who did the first Holocaust are still the people who are doing the present one.
You also use the word eerie. You say, I also find it eerie that Planned Parenthood, the world's largest abortion provider and the world's most powerful pro-abortion propaganda machine, has never repudiated its founder, Margaret Sanger's enthusiastic embracing of Nazi eugenics. She had a personal relationship, or friendship, I should say, with some of the high-ranking Nazi doctors.
Yeah.
Why is it people don't hear about it, let alone them repudiating it?
Because the American Library Association, which is against censorship, has censored the one book on Margaret Sanger's life that reveals that. The others whitewash it.
And that was Grand Illusion?
Yes.
Is that the book by George Grant?
Yep.
You say, our establishment is pro-killing. Why should we be surprised to find it pro-censorship? Why should we expect those who are anti-life to be pro-truth?
Yeah. Deep down, we know that abortion is murder. So we have to suppress that knowledge if we're pro-choice. So unlike a question like capital punishment or the validity of a war like the Iraq War, about which there may be honest and serious disagreement, this is not a question on which there can be honest and serious disagreement.
Now, you quote also in this book about the landmark book by German doctors, Life Unworthy of Life. And I remember seeing actually a documentary that was made during the war years, where they were, using it against the Jews and turning, the images from a Jew into a rat, etc. And he also talking about having myself a handicapped child, basically how we need these people who really, because they're mentally deficient or whatever, it would be better and mercy killing, basically. Yeah. And you mention that in here and connect that. You talk about the big lie, but then you also say something called the big truth. When you talk about Mussolini using the big truth and Hitler using the big lie. And that's what we see going on with these kinds of things, right?
The big truth is that if you're a moral relativist, you can get away with anything, and it's power that's going to decide things. Or even a kind of soft power. The doctors who wrote that book, Life Unworthy of Life, justified active euthanasia not by power, but by compassion. These poor people are suffering. Let's put them out of their misery. Many people's hearts are in the right place, but their heads aren't connected with their hearts. So in order to relieve human suffering, they'll kill people. You do that with animals, out of compassion. The animal rights movement insists that people are just animals and animals are people, so there's no difference, so we could do it with people too. If you believe that a human being has a soul and has a moral responsibility, and an animal doesn't, then there's an enormous gap there. And the compassion that justifies shooting a horse doesn't justify shooting a human being.
Yeah, I know Mother Angelica would always talk about this concept of false compassion that's out there, misleads people.
In fact, Walker Percy went so far as to say in one of his novels, it was compassion that led to the death camps. Because it was compassion that motivated those German doctors to justify active euthanasia in their book, Life Unworthy of Life. And thus the moral principle of the sanctity of life was undermined in Germany, and only because of that was Hitler's eugenics program allowed and popular.
And just before we take the break, talking about 3 approaches to abortion, in the dialogue that you have, I just thought it was interesting. Libby says, you really think a pro-choicer like me and a pro-lifer like you can have a rational dialogue on abortion? And she says, sure. And she says, you probably also think the Red Sox can win a World Series, don't you?
Well, some things are intrinsically impossible.
Okay.
Some things are under a curse, but I don't think the dialogue of pro-life pro-choice is under a curse. The Red Sox are.
Well, as a New York Yankee fan, I had to ask you that question.
You look so human.
We're speaking here with Dr. Peter Kreeft. Going to take a break talking about 3 approaches to abortion. Much more with him. When we come back, we'll talk about how to win the culture war. Stay with us right here on Bookmark. And thank you for staying with us right here on this special on-location bookmark with Dr. Peter Kreeft from Boston College here at the Burns Library, speaking in this section about his book, How to Win the Culture War, entitled A Christian Battle Plan for a Society in Crisis. And let me ask you the question. You say the battle lines have been drawn, but you say it's a Christian battle plan. Is it up to Christians?
It's up to Christians, but we have allies. The lines are not fundamentally between Christians and Jews or Christians and Muslims or Catholics and Protestants. The battle line is fundamentally between God's friends and God's enemies, between the roots of Western civilization, which are in the Judeo-Christian tradition, and those who hate that civilization and want to demolish it.
Now, you say this book is for James Dobson, Richard John Newhouse, and Alan Keyes, and you refer to them as the Eisenhower, Churchill, and MacArthur of World War III. How'd you come up with them, and how'd you assign them those roles?
Well, World War III is the culture war. They are mighty warriors on the right side of the culture war, and they're from very different theological traditions.
Now, you say here that you identify our enemy. Who is our enemy?
Satan.
Ultimately.
That's very clear. Actually, we have 2 enemies. Our enemies are principalities and powers, Satan and his evil spirits, and our enemies are our own sins. If we don't see that, we're going to think that our enemies are the bad guys, the Protestants, the Jews, the Muslims, the secularists, the Hindus, the modernists, the liberals, the bishops, whoever. No, they're our friends.
Well, are they misguided, or is it part of us being distracted on purpose?
Of course, of course. That's what Satan loves to do. Any military commander, if you can divide his enemy, will be able to conquer them. Divide and conquer, most simple elementary strategy.
Mm-hmm. Do you also see in this the whole idea of Satan's great victory in convincing people that he doesn't exist at all?
Sure. C.S. Lewis says at the beginning of Screwtape Letters, Satan is equally pleased with either of 2 errors about him, overestimating him or underestimating him. Mm-hmm. If you're at war and you vastly overestimate the power of your enemy, or you vastly underestimate his power, you'll probably lose.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's groups in our society who are doing both at this time?
It's not very popular to overestimate him anymore. Maybe some fundamentalists. Right. Okay. But it's certainly very popular to underestimate him.
Mm-hmm. You talk about in Chapter 3, in the kind of war we are in, you talk about true and false spiritual warfare. What is false spiritual warfare?
False spiritual warfare is motivated by hate and fear. True spiritual warfare is motivated by faith and love. We're at war not because we want to be. War is not a good thing, but we're at war because we've been attacked. And when we fight with the confidence that we can win, and because we're fighting for God and for what God is, which is truth and love, then we're fighting in a very different spirit than fighting just out of reaction of fear and hate of the enemy.
Mm-hmm. Now, in Chapter 5, entitled Our Enemy's Battle Plan, Satan's Strategy for the Third Millennium, it starts off with, I will not tell you how this speech fell into my hands. It was apparently written by Satan himself, and his listeners to it are demons and a captive audience. I guess kind of Screwtape, speaking of Screwtape Letters. Is that where you got the idea?
It's a shameless imitation of C.S. Lewis, yes.
And what is Satan's battle plan then? What is his strategy for the Third Millennium? Just dividing and conquering us? And you mentioned that the fiercest battle has to do with the sex wars.
I think part of his battle plan is a brilliant strategy, which I call his 7-step sexual strategy. His ultimate end is to win souls for hell. In order to do that, a means to that end would be step 1. The ultimate end is to win souls for hell. Step 2, one powerful means to that end is to corrupt our society, because souls are influenced by our society. Step 3, the most powerful means to destroy society is to destroy its most fundamental building block, which is the family. Step 4, you destroy the family by destroying its foundation, stable marriage. Step 5, marriage is destroyed by loosening its glue, which is sexual fidelity. Step 6, fidelity is destroyed by the sexual revolution. And step 7, infiltrate the media, and they are the main perpetrators of the sexual revolution. So he gets at our souls through our hormones.
And those are all things that have already happened, and today we're obviously dealing with the whole same-sex marriage issue, right?
Sure. It's a religion. I don't think we can understand it unless we understand that. It's not just a sexual issue, it's a religious issue. If you've lost the real God, then you've got to have something that's an adequate substitute or a semi-adequate substitute, something that gives you the same kind of self-transcending joy and thrill that we're designed for in heaven. Well, sex is one obvious candidate. I had a conversation once with a homosexual activist, which was very enlightening in that regard. I asked him the question, how come you, of all people, identify with what you do? Other people don't do that. They say, this is what I am and this is what I do. He called himself a Catholic homosexual. So I said, you're an intelligent person. Maybe you can explain to me why what you do, which granted you don't think is sinful, and we do, but why you're the only class of sinners that identifies with your sin. I'm a coward. I don't say I am a coward. Alcoholics don't say I am my alcoholism. Adulterers don't say I am my adultery, but you say I am this, and if you hate what we do, you hate us. I said, that's not true. We love you. We think you're made in the image of God and you're called to be a saint. But we don't love what you do. And you reject that very distinction. Why? He said, I think I can make you understand that. Suppose I said to you, I hate what you do. You pray and you go to Mass and you worship. And I hate your religion, but I love you. So I'm going to put all the pressures against your religion and I'm going to speak against it, but I really love you. Wouldn't you feel personally persecuted? And I thought for a minute and I said, you know, you've really answered my question. Yes, I would. But now I have a question for you. You call yourself a Catholic homosexual. Which of those two is your religion? Okay. Your religion is your very identity. So if you persecute my religion, you persecute me. It's not like my clothes or my ideology. Okay. So I think this is their religion.
Mm-hmm. Now you talk about the secret weapon that will win the war. You talk about this theme about us being saints, or the saints being the solution, in several of your books.
Yeah. Saints are spiritual warriors. Saints are the spies that God infiltrates into a secular society. You can't argue with saints. You can argue with arguments. You can argue with philosophers and theologians. You can argue with bishops and church authorities. You can't argue with saints. They changed the world 2,000 years ago.
And we know the way it's going to end up because we know the way the world is going to end up. So in 9, when you talk about prognosis for victory, a fight we must win, or why we must win. We know we're going to win, but you talk a little bit about how we're going to win.
I don't know how long the world's going to be around. I don't know whether it's going to get better or worse. I don't know how successful our fighting is going to be. The only two things I do know, because God has told us, is what the end result is going to be, and that's good news, and what our job is. He's told us what to do. He's given us the weapons. The fight may be a long one, it may be a short one. Western civilization may survive, it may not. We're not promised anything about Western civilization. We're promised that the church will survive even the gates of hell. So it may be that we will lose the political battle, but we'll never lose the spiritual battle.
Do you think that's a mistake sometimes we make in trying to manage these kind of culture wars, in the sense of evaluating the short-term political gains or losses?
Oh, of course, and we idolize our own civilization. I myself love America. I wouldn't rather live anywhere else, and Western civilization is a great thing. But to confuse that with the kingdom of God is idolatry. And if our civilization does not repent, God will destroy it. It's inevitable. It doesn't require a miracle from heaven. It's just a kind of suicide.
Well, do you see even inside, I'm sure society, but I know inside the church, that there's so many people who just want the truth to be spoken? It's like we know what the truth is. We're just like, will somebody say it?
Yeah, please, please, just honesty. And I don't know, I'm not qualified to speak against bishops and priests, but we don't hear from the pulpit every Sunday what we should hear. the things that we don't know. We hear the things that we do know. We hear little homilies that pat us on the head and reinforce us. But what an opportunity to educate millions of Americans on what they don't know. But that's not my expertise.
Do you see a light there on that side, inside the church, that maybe we are returning to some more of the basics, and that there is an attempt at least to try to inculcate the appropriate ideas to the youth? And
oh, absolutely. Light is shining. The pendulum always swings in every field. When things get so bad, the organism either dies or it fights the disease. And we're fighting the disease. There are all sorts of good signs on the horizon. There are better catechetical texts, there are better bishops, there are better magazines. The laity is rising up and educating the clergy.
And that's a hopeful sign, especially with the appropriate lay involvement.
A very hopeful sign. The church is alive. It doesn't just sit there passively and take whatever blows are offered to it. It fights back. The organism grows and the dead wood falls off and new buds come, and that's happening.
Let me ask you as an author, what's next for Peter Kreeft? What's on your horizon?
Hope to finish my novel this year.
Okay.
Have just finished a book called The Philosophy of Tolkien. Ignatius Press is putting that out.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll have to try and get you back on to talk about that book.
And writing a series of introductory philosophy books. Socrates meets the great philosophers and cross-examines them in purgatory. They have to defend their books to him.
Okay, that sounds interesting. Let me just go back to your novel, because I know in one of our earlier programs you talked about how you write anywhere you happen to be, online at the supermarket or whatever. Do you write differently when you're writing a novel than you do when you wrote some of your other philosophical books?
Very differently. The amount of notes I have for another book is minuscule. The amount of notes I have for this is 10 times the length of the book already. Because a novel has to be a world if it's going to be realistic. And you also need live models. You can't just use your imagination.
And I know you said in an earlier interview that your characters, in fact in this interview, the characters kind of go their own way, the ones who are involved in this debate in the book about abortion. But do you know how, like the world, how the novel is going to end up, or are the characters leading you there?
The characters lead me there, and they also strangely lead me to a kind of wonderful pluralism. They're all weird and they're all different, and yet they're all fighting on the right side of the culture war. This is a novel about spiritual warfare.
Good, and thank you for being on the right side of the culture war. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your
Dr. Kreeft, for your time. Speaking about a couple of fine books, the first one, 3 Approaches to Abortion, the other, How to Win the Culture War, both available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. I'm Doug Keck. Thank you for joining us for the special On Location from Boston College. See you next time.